My day yesterday was absolutely the opposite of Grant's day. So he goes to the mall. We woke up yesterday, and Sherry looks at me, and she goes, we don't have anything today. And that in our house is a huge surprise. Like, that's like a gift from heaven when we don't have something going on. Like, anyone that ever happened, like all of a sudden you wake up on a Saturday morning, you realize we don't have anything going on. Anyone, like, raise your hand if it's ever happened to you? Yeah. Like, so there's this moment for us. We have 2 teenage daughters and a near teenage daughter, and we have pretty busy lives and lots of activity. And so for us, like, waking up on a Saturday morning and being like, what are we going to do? Like, I'll tell you what we're not going to do. We're not going to the mall, that's for sure. That's like one thing. Been there, done that. Like, we're not doing that. So actually, instead of that, we just like hung around. Sherry and the girls went and did some run at Manitou. They invited me. I was like, no, thank you. I don't have to do anything today. And so we call it a do what want day around my house. And that's what I did, was what want. And so the first thing was to head to my basement where my bikes are hanging in my basement. And so I went down there and I was working on one of my bikes and kind of cleaning and doing stuff. And just hour after hour was going by and I was like, this is so amazing. And then I had some projects in the garage to do, some things that I wanted to accomplish. And so I went out to the garage and so this is like starting to be afternoon. And so I go to the garage. One of my projects actually was really fun because I got these wheels for my car, some like winter wheels and tires, really cheap. And so I had to paint the wheels. And so I turned the heater on really hot in the garage and I'm painting the wheels. And so Sherry came out at some point and she goes, are you trying to get high? And I looked at her and at that moment I realized, not really, but high enough that I'm not thinking about the fact I'm putting the tires next to the heater with flammable chemicals to dry, like right next to each other. So I kind of looked and I was like, no, it's good. Go back inside. And then I like moving stuff away. I was like, what am I doing? I'm going to blow up the house, you know? So then I kind of got done with that project and I was looking at the tires and they were drying, obviously, because the garage was hot. And I looked at the tires and I thought, you know what? It's dry out. I could put these on my car and kind of be ready for the snow. I'm like already, you know, like thinking this is great. So I get everything ready. And I, you know, like sometimes guys, like we nerd out on this stuff. And so I swept the garage out because you want to work in a clean garage, you know. And then I got the tires and I placed the tires around the garage next to where each one would go and got everything staged, got all my tools out, all this stuff. Then I decided, you know what, while I've got the car up, I'm going to make sure I'm cleaning everything underneath. And so I'm getting all the cleaning stuff. So I get it all set up and ready. By this time it's dark and my garage door is closed and the lights in my garage aren't really bright. So I'm just kind of standing there, I'm looking, I'm like, this is not going to work. So then I began an hour-long obsession trying to make my garage brighter. So first of all, it meant like standing tiptoe on a stepladder, almost dying a couple of times, changing the light bulbs. I wanted higher wattage. So I got higher wattage light bulbs and I changed those. I come down the ladder, I look around, I'm like, still not good enough. So then I go over and my grandfather, when he died, I got this like light that I think was made when light bulbs were invented. It's like one of those things on a cord, you know, with the metal grate around it, except mine looks like 100 years old. And it's one of those things, like actually every time I plug it in, I always walk up to the outlet and I always think this could be it. Like, this is my last moment. And every time I plug it in, I'm always like, just jump back and just make sure you don't die. So I turned it on and it wasn't working right. It was like flickering, which most people with a 100-year-old piece of electricity would just be like, don't use it. Not me. I just messed with it, took it apart, tried to get it working, spent like another 30 minutes getting this thing working, hang it in the garage, look down, look at the back end of the car, and I'm like, it's bright up there, but it's just like not good enough here. Like there is not enough light. And so then I go over and I put a headlamp on. Not kidding. So now I've got lights hanging in the garage. All the light bulbs changed. I've got a headlamp on and I still bothered to grab a flashlight. So I'm sitting there so I can really see down there. Like, and I'm sitting there thinking, like, this is ridiculous. If Sherry came out and saw how little I've gotten done, it would be over. I mean, I'm having a blast here. And then I started thinking about today, and I started thinking about what I'm talking about, and this whole idea, the fact that I'm obsessing in my garage about there not being enough light. Like, there's just something, like there was that, I was driven crazy by the fact that I couldn't see the way that I wanted to see. There wasn't enough detail. I've already got bad eyesight, so like it was this moment for me where it's like there needs to be more light in this moment right now. And I start thinking about what we're talking about in this series, Illuminate. The reality that God's first activity in creation was giving us light. Last week, we began looking at this picture of light throughout the scriptures and what it represents and how God works. And in fact, it's interesting because one day this last week I was reading a blog article and some person was talking about a pastor and how this pastor had gone off the deep end because he was associating light with God. And I literally thought, has this person writing the blog never read the scriptures? Because the Bible associates light and God over and over. From the very beginning, the book of Genesis opens with the earth being formless and void, being dark and chaotic. And the first act of our Creator, as the story of humanity and God begins, is to bring order to the chaos and light into the darkness. And that light is what begins to change and shape the whole nature of the relationship. And then as we read on, and what we looked at last week was that humanity makes the decision to go on in darkness, that humanity makes the choice to begin to walk into chaos, and life becomes chaotic. We see life in the pages of the Old Testament as a life of pain and heartache. We see life being filled with relational frustrations and vocational frustrations and financial catastrophes and emotional things and physical things. And like we just see a picture of life in all of its brokenness being painted in the pages of the Old Testament. It's broken and it's dark. And then what we saw last week is that in the New Testament we become very clearly introduced to Jesus as the one who is the light of the world. Jesus comes and brings the light into the darkness. While we're waiting in the dark, Jesus enters. There's a story in John chapter 8, later on in the same book, the same narrative of the life of Jesus. There's a story in John chapter 8 that some of you might be familiar with it, but there's this moment when Jesus is traveling, and as he's traveling, the popularity of Jesus keeps increasing, and religious leaders are always challenging Jesus in the various places that he goes. Because Jesus had this reputation that was really undoing a lot of the things that kept them in control. It kept them in positions of power. It kept them in a position of being able to manipulate people. It also was a religiosity that was so old and historic, people didn't know how to break from it. And Jesus had this reputation of presenting love and grace and a God who's compassionate and caring and brings peace and joy. And this was brand new. And so Jesus was this controversial character as he traveled. And there's scene that takes place in John chapter 8 where Jesus is traveling through this particular city. And the religious leaders bring this woman out to the crowd. Now, there's always a crowd when Jesus is out and about. But these religious leaders bring this woman to the crowd. And this woman has been caught in adultery. So this woman's done something. She's violated the marriage that she's in. And in that culture, it meant she was to be stoned publicly. That was the law that was supposed to be followed. Now, because of Jesus' reputation, the religious leaders knew this is going to be an issue for him. Mr. Love and Compassion and Grace, what are you going to do with this when the law says we're supposed to treat her this way? So they bring her out and they do what would Jesus do? Like, Jesus, what would you do with this situation? She's been caught. What are you going to do? And then there's this scene where he kneels down and he begins writing in the dirt as these guys are all gathered around. You just picture this huge crowd, dusty street, and Jesus is writing in the dirt, and there's kind of a moment of everybody watching, and then he stands and he says something that is one of the more famous sayings of Jesus. He says, "He who has not sinned, cast the first stone." And then he kneels back down and keeps writing in the dirt. We don't really know what he's writing. Nobody knows. Some people estimate that maybe he was writing the sins of the people around there. I just think he was buying some time while those guys let it sink in, right? Like, he who has not sinned, cast the first stone. He put it back on them and said, "Are you without sin?" Slowly, this group of men start to dissipate into the crowd. They start to find their way back amongst the people. And Jesus is left now standing here with this woman, and people are watching. That's why we know the story. People are watching, and there's this moment of, well, what's he going to do? And Jesus looks at the woman and he says, "I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. Don't live this life of brokenness." And then, after he sends her, the next thing that Jesus turns to the crowd and begins to teach to them is John chapter 8, verse 12. He says this, out of this moment of darkness and light, he says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Imagine those guys sitting there in that moment. You're like, everybody's watching, and they know, even though this is religious, even though this is legal, even there was like a part of them that knew this situation is so broken. Like, it's broken for her, and it's broken for the religious leader. It's broken for the people who were standing on the sidelines saying there's like something wrong with these guys doing this. Like all of this is darkness. And Jesus stands out of this moment, and he goes, there will be no more darkness when you follow me. Like the brokenness and the ridiculousness and the tension, there is light that penetrates the darkness. I am the light of the world, and those that follow me, they illuminate their own lives, and this darkness, this brokenness, this insanity that humanity lives in dissipates at my very presence. I bring light into darkness. I make order out of chaos. That's what Jesus says out of a practical moment like that. A little later in the book of John, actually the next chapter, when you turn the pages over, Jesus is walking with his disciples, and they find themselves in another very broken darkness sort of moment. They're walking, and there's a man they pass, and he's described as the man who's born blind. Now, that description we have mainly because these guys say, what happened to this guy that he was born blind? The reason they knew must have been some sort of cultural clue, must have been something about where he was sitting, or maybe the fact that he was a known person. We don't know the details around this man. All we know is that he's a man who was born blind. He was born that way. And the disciples actually asked Jesus, they say, was it his parents that sinned, or was it he that sinned? What are they doing when they ask that question? Like, sometimes you go, well, yeah, because the religious system of their day said that this man is blind because somebody did something. That's the only explanation we have for human brokenness, is somebody must have done something to deserve this, right? And so when they say, was it their parent that sinned, or was it him that sinned, which is a ridiculous question if he was born blind, right? But they ask it. Why do they ask it? Because life is filled with moments of darkness. Life is filled with unexplained moments when we go, God, is this really what like life's supposed to be like? And why is there hurting? And why is there heartache? And why is there frustration? And why are there people that are born blind? And why are there children that find themselves in these types of family? There's all these sorts of questions that we can wrestle with in our life. Like, why does this stuff happen? The disciples in that moment, that's all they're doing, is asking the same questions you and I ask all the time, right? Like, why? Explain this. Somebody help me understand this. What's fascinating is Jesus in that very moment doesn't say, well, guys, let me tell you all the theological ramifications of your question and make sure that I answer it with 3 points and some fill in the blanks. Jesus actually just does something about it. And this is that scene. Like, if I had to be healed by Jesus, this is the one that I'm like, can I choose a different one? Because this is the one where Jesus, if you know the story, he kneels down and he gets some dirt and he spits in the dirt and he makes mud. Like, can you just touch me and heal me? But you got to put mud in. And so then he takes the mud and he puts it on the man's eyes, and he's healed. Jesus enters this broken situation and just literally brings healing to it. He brings light to it. He brings hope to it. Somebody had to be blamed for the brokenness, but Jesus, instead of diving into that, just says, listen, in this moment, he says, guys, I am the light of the world. And he again repeats this idea that he is the light of the world. In fact, that stirs a conversation that continues, because this guy that was born blind, the Pharisees are all up in arms about it. Like, who healed you? Because this is an issue. We need to know. Like, there's somebody out there healing people that are blind. Somebody's in trouble, right? Like, Jesus didn't get a permit for this, right? Like, you are outside of the healing codes of this municipality, right? So there's this conversation, and in this conversation, Jesus says to them, literally, he uses this metaphorical picture, and he says, I came to give sight to the blind. Like, there are people that are living in darkness. There are situations that are surrounded and characterized by darkness, and Jesus says, the reason that I've come is that I am the light of the world. I've come because I'm the light of the world, and I let people see that are walking in darkness. I heal what's broken. He's the light, shining in the dark, making order out of chaos, bringing sight to the blind. He is the very presence of God, the light of salvation. Now, many of us know this, don't we? There's something that happens, and if you call yourself a Christ follower, there's something that happens for most of us that are really Christ followers. And if you've stepped across that line where you say, you know what I do, I follow Jesus, my guess is that there was a circumstance. There was a situation. There was something that happened. And maybe you knew about Jesus. Maybe you grew up around the church and there was an ideology of the church and Jesus, and you maybe ascribed to it. Maybe Jesus resolved philosophical questions in a way that was plausible to you, and so you were a Christ follower because of that. Or maybe you just chose to believe this and there was some sort of intellectual dynamic to it. There's a lot of things where a lot of people who have experiences with Jesus that are very, very cerebral. We believe certain things to be true about him. But when you're a Christ follower, for most of us that are Christ followers, there's a moment. There's a point in time. There was a situation where the world went dark around you. Like there was a relationship that blew up, or there was a loss that was unexplained, or there was a job scenario, or there was something inside of you where there was anxiety and there was worry. There's like you look at people who are Christ followers, and if you track back in their story time and time again, what you see is that there was a moment when they were in darkness, and Jesus entered that moment. And he gave them strength they didn't know they had, and he gave them joy when they didn't think they could even laugh. Gave them peace when there was anxiety. Gave them hope in the middle of loss. There's a story, there's a moment in time, and that for many of us is what we hold on to. So even the ups and the downs and the peaks and the valleys of our relationship with Christ are oftentimes held together by these experiences we've had where we go, you know what? I know what I believe intellectually, but I've also experienced him personally. Like Jesus came into my darkness, right? Like Jesus came into a moment, and I don't know how I would have gotten through it without him. That's what we hold to. We know this to be true. We know that Jesus enters the dark, and when he enters the dark, there is no explanation for it, and that's why we follow him. And for many of us, that's what's galvanized our faith, is it went from something that we believed to something that we experienced and lived. We walked in the dark, we waited in the dark, and Jesus met us. Because he's the light of the world. Agreed? Here's what's really interesting. Jesus is the light of the world. John says he is. He says he is. Others say that he is. We all agree that he is. And then in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is beginning a sermon that's called the Sermon on the Mount. He actually begins this sermon very much the way that we've started our time this morning. He begins by talking about they're called the Beatitudes. But he says, you're blessed when the days are dark, when you're poor, when you're meek, when you're hurting. He says, you're blessed in the darkness. You're blessed. And so there's this acknowledgement, like he's saying, guys, that's what binds us together, is we experience the blessing of God in the middle of our brokenness. But then in verse 12 of Matthew chapter 5, he flips this whole thing around in a way that's absolutely mind-blowing. It's absolutely mind-blowing because this is what he says. Actually, verse 14 is where we'll look at. Verse 14, he says this. You are the light of the world. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. You are the light of the world. You know when I read that, you know what I do? I have a little conversation with Jesus, and it goes like this. You're the light of the world. And he goes, no. Well, yeah, but you're the light of the world. I'm like, no. You're the light of the world, right? Like, which one is it? Like, Jesus, we just got done seeing how you're the light of the world, and now you're looking at me and saying, I'm the light of the world. Like, one of us has to be wrong here, right? Like, is this possible? Like, we just got done agreeing that you're the light of the world, and then Jesus turns to us and says, you're the light of the world. Which one is it, right? Like, this could be very confusing. Jesus says, if you follow me, if you participate in this light with me, if you have experienced me, then you now come to the dark places in life and you bring light. You make the darkness come to life because you've experienced me. You are the light of the world. He's reversing the whole thing. Like he's giving us a radically different job description. He's turning this whole thing around on us. He's saying, listen, you're the light of the world. What does the light do? The light illuminates in the darkness. The light brings color and life, does it not? Like when you think about the early morning of a day, like before the sun comes up, the light is gray. And after the sun goes down and the sunset's dissipated, the light is gray. You can't distinguish colors. It's very flat. When there's light, there's color, there's life, there's a vividness to it. Jesus says, you and we are the light of the world. We bring color to life and we bring light to the darkness. That's what he's describing. And you say, well, how do I do that? Like, Jesus, that's really cool, but you're also God in the flesh. Like, that's the whole reason we celebrate you at Christmas, because you're a little different than me, right? How do I become the light of the world? I think that's the tension. He says, I do this for you. And you go, well, I could never do what you do for me. And yet, even the way that Jesus is describing this unpacks how we carry it out. In verse 12 of Matthew 5, he says that we are salt. In verse 14, he says we're light. He says you're salt in this world, bringing out the flavors of God. He says you're light, illuminating the darkness. You know what's interesting about salt and light? They are two of the most common things that we can experience as human beings, right? There's nothing unique or special about salt. Case in point. You get a big old block of Morton salt, put it on a ring, and look at your sweetheart and say, will you marry me? Right? Oh, no, you didn't, right? There's nothing special or unique about this mineral called salt. It's everywhere. It's plentiful, right? It's this very common, very ordinary thing. And light is something that's so ordinary, we get to experience it every day, whether we like it or not, right? It will shine in your windows and wake you up regardless, right? Light just happens. They are two of the most ordinary things. Jesus uses the most ordinary of objects and elements to say that you are the light of the world. You have an opportunity to make a difference. Why? Because you and I live very ordinary lives, right? He uses the ordinary and then looks to us and we say, well, what about my ordinary relationships? My relationships are so ordinary. Like, Jesus, your relationships are ordinary for a reason. Like these ordinary relationships, the ones that you have because of the job that you got 10 years ago. The ordinary relationship you have because you moved in next to somebody and you don't really like them, but they're just your neighbor, right? Like, you have ordinary relationships. Like, you have ordinary things in your life. You have an ordinary job, and you just go to your ordinary job and you do it, and isn't that special? And you go, it's just an ordinary thing, right? Or maybe it's you're at your house, and every day your ordinary life is just getting your kids dressed and out the door and getting them to show up at school on time, right? It's very ordinary. There are all of these ordinary moments. There are ordinary activities, and there's just life. Life is ordinary, and Jesus uses the most ordinary of elements to paint a picture of our very ordinary lives being extraordinary. You are the light of the world, and it's in the context of this ordinary life that you bring light into the darkness. Jesus says you're the light of the world. The Apostle Paul, over and over again, uses this same message to say, if you follow Jesus, like, if you call yourself a Christ follower, then you take this seriously. Like, if you've recognized your need for light in the darkness, then you also choose to be one who brings the light into the darkness. Which brings a question about, what kind of influence do you have in the ordinary places of your life? That's a real question. In the ordinary recreation, in the ordinary job, in the ordinary list of to-dos, in the ordinary grocery shopping, and in the ordinary neighborhood stuff, what kind of influence do you have? Do you bring light into the darkness? And the reason that Jesus is saying you and I are here is that we provide a light to the pathway to God. Like, we're directing people's paths. He literally says, you are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. He says, let your light shine before men. Like, he's being very clear about this. The life of somebody who's a Christ follower should be lived in such a way that it draws people to God. Is that the influence that you have? It's like nowhere in this does Jesus say, okay, I just came so that you would have light, and then it would just kind of stay here with you, right? Like Jesus doesn't say, I came to give you a headlamp so that you could just kind of walk around and make your own way. A couple weeks back, my friend Jason shows up at my house on a Wednesday morning to go for a trail run, and it was really dark, and he brought his dog, who was crazy and runs all over. And he gets out of his truck, and he goes, oh man, he goes, my headlamp's broken, it doesn't work, whatever. And I go, that's bad news, because my headlamp, the batteries are dying. And so we go for a run. I put my headlamp on, and I've got just my headlamp, which is normally kind of for you. And I'm trying to run through this trail in the dark, in the woods, on a Wednesday morning. And I'm running with my head, trying to aim the light so he can see, and his dog ahead of me. And finally, after about 10 minutes of ridiculousness, he goes, all right, I'm just going to get behind you. I think it works a lot better that way. Because a headlamp isn't meant to do that, right? Jesus didn't give you a headlamp. He didn't say, listen, I just want to light your little way so that your little life is really good. He goes, no, I've given you a lamp. You're like a city set on a hill. There's a reason that you're here, and it's to let your light shine for other people to see. Nowhere does he give you an excuse and say, this is cool if you just hide it under a bushel, right? No. Right? I'm going to let it. Yeah, some of you were like, what is going on? How does everyone know this? It's like a flash mob at church. No. We sat through bad days of Sunday school. That's what that was, right? Jesus uses such strong words to emphasize this. He literally says, do not hide your light. Don't hide your light. In reference to this, there are really three kinds of Christ followers. And I just want to give them to you. And I'm going to give them to you. Maybe you want to write them down. But more than writing them down, maybe it's something just to think through. Who am I? When I think about these three Christ followers, which one do I fall into? And I know that not everybody here is a Christ follower. But for those of us that are, here are the three categories that we tend to fall into regarding this whole idea of being the light of the world. The first one is that there are private Christians. Private Christians. Here's what a private Christian is. It's somebody who absolutely has very solid faith in Christ, and he has illuminated the dark places of their life. And they simultaneously have lots of exposure to the dark places in this world. They live in dark neighborhoods, and they live in dark workplaces. They go every day. They have conversations, and they see the darkness. They experience the darkness. They hang out sometimes with the darkness, right? They recreate with people that are living in the dark. They have exponentially great numbers of chances to be exposed to people that are just living in darkness. They see lots of chaos. They experience it. They get a front row seat to it, but they never let anybody know what they believe. That is a private Christian. They believe wholeheartedly, but whether it's anxiety or fear or thoughts of being rejected, they can't imagine ever bringing light into the darkness. The second group is a secluded Christian. The secluded Christian has a very legitimate faith. Jesus has illuminated the dark places of their life. And somewhere along the way, they developed so many friends who were Christians that they never hung out with anybody ever again that didn't follow Jesus, right? They fill their calendar every week, and it is all about people who are following Jesus. And they happen to maybe work in a place where it seems like everybody's praying at lunch, right? Or maybe they retired, and so they just don't have the relationships. Or maybe their kids graduated from school or quit playing soccer, and that was the only place they knew anybody that was walking in darkness. They find themselves now living in a place where everything, every day, is just like this Christian utopia, and they really don't know anybody that walks or lives in the darkness. Jesus speaks to both of these people and says, let your light shine. Like the third group. The third group is what I call the public Christian. The public Christian has deep relationships with people who are living in darkness. They're deeply embedded in the culture around them. They're well aware of the brokenness. It doesn't make them uncomfortable or nervous. It doesn't rattle their cage. And they're not afraid to let people know what they believe. They don't force people to agree with them, but at the same time, they don't hesitate in describing what they believe and why they believe it. And when opportunities come, they mention it. There's a public faith. That's what Jesus is describing, is that we live our lives in such a way that as we go out into the world, it's not with a headlamp to light our way, but with a lantern that says, hang around me and eventually you'll see God. You'll experience Him. You'll come near to Him. You'll see more of Him if you hang around here. That's the end game, a public faith for all of us. There are two great experiences I think that we have in our life. One is when we get to experience Jesus entering the darkness for us. In those moments, whether the first time or every time after, it's unbelievable when it happens. But the other most significant, greatest moment that we ever experience as Christ followers is when somebody else for the first time begins to understand who Jesus is and what He's really all about. That's an amazing experience as a Christ follower, and completely to be a part of our experience following Him. How do you go from being private or secluded to being public with your faith? I'm going to give you a couple of things. And one of the things that I want to talk about, I'll talk about next week a little bit, that'll help some of this, inform some of it. But I want to talk about two things. The first one, to help those of you that have a private faith. You believe, but you just never talk about it. It has to do with the wattage of the bulb. First thing I did in my garage when I needed more light to shine into the darker places of my garage was change the light bulbs. I looked up and I had 60-watt bulbs hanging out up there. And I'm like, this isn't going to do it, right? So I got like floodlights. My power meter just started going spinning, and I was like, man, let's light this place up. When it comes to us penetrating the dark places with our lives and being a person that can be more public in our faith, it begins with us inviting God to illuminate our own lives at a greater rate. And oftentimes the reason that we hesitate to be public, or the reason that we're not confident, is because we lack the personal experiences where God has illuminated the dark moments of our life. The light is just barely glowing in the dark places of our life. And so we're like, yeah, I don't know. Like, your confidence may not be there. It may just be something that you hold on to in desperation, but it's not really the source of all that's around you. Does that make sense? So becoming public in our faith means we tune in, we press in for God, we look for Him, we want to see the experiences of light coming into darkness in our own moments, not just on a Sunday at church, but to say, man, where are the dark places of my life? And we're inviting God to illuminate those places on a greater basis. Like to say, God, I want to see you interact with me more frequently. It's saying there are questions in my life that I'm not letting you answer. I think I want to let you start answering those. I have stories in my life that need to be changed. I need to start trusting you with those. I need to start letting your light shine brighter in my life. And the natural result of that will be that as you begin to experience the wisdom of God, and you begin to experience the light of God coming into the dark places, the transformation in your story, you'll become increasingly confident, not to force people to believe like you do, but just to simply say, there are things I've experienced that I'd love to share with you. God will deposit things in you. He will give you resources and tools that you never imagined. You'll have stories to tell that you say, you know what, this is just a little bit of something that I can share with you. This last week I was talking with a friend, we were sitting down and we were just describing just the tension I think that sometimes exists. And then you realize, like with this whole conversation of penetrating the darkness and just being a light in our world, I think sometimes if you're a private Christian or a secluded Christian, you can forget that we are in a culture where on a regular basis, we all gather in this room and we say, God, would you speak to me and give me wisdom for life? Show me the way. Give me some direction. We look to each other in community groups and we challenge each other to grow and take paths that are sometimes not the easiest path to take. That's an uncommon thing. When you meet people and you have relationship and friendship with people that live outside of the community of faith, they wander. There's such a lack of wisdom. There's such a lack of truth. There's such a lack of genuine friendship that says, can I come alongside of you in a dark moment and just be there for you? So when you let the light of God shine, not only do you have your life illuminated, but God deposits in you a wealth of wisdom and knowledge and love and care that you can bring to others. And so if your faith is private, suddenly it has the opportunity to become more public. If your faith is secluded, it really comes down to one thing, and that's proximity. If you find yourself in a place where you say, I don't really have much exposure to the darkness, well, it's a proximity thing. Think about this. There's a room full of lights, lamps, and they're all on except for one. And you walk in and you turn that one lamp on. What kind of difference does it make? Not much, right? Turn off all the other lamps and walk into that room and now go turn that one lamp on. What kind of difference does it make? It makes all the difference in the world. You and I, penetrating the darkness, finding ourselves in places where we can bring the light. It may not be the most comfortable. It may not be the warmest place. But when our light shines, it shines brighter and has greater impact. I know some of you go, man, are you just telling me like I just walked out of the darkness? Like I've been living in a really dark place and I'm just trying to follow Jesus and you want me to go back? For some of you in certain circumstances, I say, why don't you just wait a little bit, right? But for the rest of us, that's not an excuse. The challenge that Jesus is giving us is to say, go into the dark and hold the lamp up and be a light and make a difference. It's a proximity thing. It's a closeness. That's what Jesus did. Jesus was so intentional with people who believed differently. He even refers to us as being enemies of God, and yet he comes to us and loves us. There's this conversation in Matthew where Jesus says, he basically says this, he says, what good is it if you just go and greet people who look just like you and believe like you do? The word greet that's used as Jesus phrases that, the way he uses it, the idea of greeting somebody is welcoming somebody into your life. Jesus says, what good is it if the only people that you welcome into your life, if the only people that you're in community with and caring for, who are caring for you, what good is it if they all look just like you and smell just like you and vote just like you and believe just like you? Like Jesus said, what good does it do? I'll confess, there's a lot of people in church that think it's supposed to be just the opposite. Like Jesus is telling you, just go greet everybody that's just like you. And Jesus says, no. Like I want you hanging out with people who don't believe like you believe. I want you loving them. I don't want you challenging them and putting threats. You never see Jesus threatening people that were far from him. Like you better or else. No, you see Jesus loving, caring, having compassion, being there. God bless you. Pluralism is a reality in our culture today. There are two aspects to pluralism. There's pluralism that is an ideology that says, well, everybody's just going to believe what they want to believe, and so that's an ideology. That's not what I'm referring to. Pluralism is just a fact. It's a reality. People believe all kinds of different things today. Jesus says, go into a very plural world where people are believing all kinds of things and show them that God loves them. Show them the love of God. That's what he tells us to do. Love your enemies. Bless those who persecute you. It's completely contrary. He says, greet those who are different than you. Because people need somebody to hear their story when the story goes dark. People need somebody to meet the need when suddenly there's a very real one and it's dark. Not long ago, there are some friends that I pray for a lot of my friends, and there were some friends I just literally thought, do they even, like their life is so good, do they even need Jesus? I had that conversation, like man, just every category, like you just go down a list, like check, like and I just found myself saying, God, like what? And then realizing to myself, you know what, there's a moment when all of a sudden the lights go out, because the lights go out. And when the lights go out, I want to be such a friend. I want to love them so much and so deeply that I can bring light to the darkness no matter what it is, no matter where it is. That's what Jesus is calling us to. Live in relationship with people. Love people who are different than you. Be intentional. They're not a project. People that don't know Jesus aren't a notch on a Christian's belt that say, like, I got a badge somehow because No, they're just be in community with people who believe differently than you and love them and bring the light of Christ. We're going to wrap up by doing a couple of different things today. Just before you get really uncomfortable, you don't have to talk to anybody. I'm not going to make you stand up or do anything weird, okay? But I am going to ask you just to close your eyes for just a moment with me. A couple of weeks ago, I did this with a group of individuals who were starting new churches in Seattle, and it was just so helpful for us there, and I just thought, I want to do this with us here. But with your eyes closed and just kind of pausing and stopping for a moment, I just want to ask that you'd find yourself standing in a place in our city, someplace that's where you regularly go. Maybe it's a corner downtown, someplace that you find yourself standing on a regular basis. Maybe it's standing outside of a grocery store where you go all the time, or standing at line at a grocery store. Maybe it's in the parking lot of your kid's school with kids and parents rushing all around you. I just want you to find yourself standing somewhere where there's lots of people and they're moving around you, someplace where you tend to frequent. And I want you to imagine being able to look around, and as you look around the people on the street, on the sidewalk, the people walking into that building, wherever it is you find yourself, as you look at those people, who do you see? You see moms pushing strollers? Do you see guys frantically fixing their tie and heading into a building? Do you picture a woman just talking on her cell phone, having a loud conversation and overhearing things that are going on in her life? Do you see people that are hurrying? Do you see people that are stressed? What's going on behind the scenes of their day? Is there relational stress? Are their kids just blowing up? Is their marriage falling apart? Is their body breaking down? What are they worried about? I want you to open your eyes. The people that are in your life every single day, the ordinary people in your life every day, whether you recognize it or not, they're living in darkness. They got broken relationships. They got broken finances. They got stress. They got internal spiritual questions. They have emotional issues. They're walking through dark days. And for me, stopping and pausing and just removing the names for a moment and just seeing them makes me realize, and the people that we work with and the people that we play with, the people that live on our street, they hurt and they ache and they're wandering in the dark and they're waiting for someone like you and I to just be there and bring the light of Christ, to bring the light of the world and illuminate the darkness and draw them towards God. When you came in today, you had a little post-it on your seat. And we're going to end by just a little activity here. I'm going to give you just a minute. But what I want you to do is now move from a place where you visualize random people to thinking about specific people. And I'm going to ask that you write down a couple of names. First name only. Don't use last names, but first name only. Write down the names of a couple of people who in your life, you know, it's just dark. It's just dark where they are. Maybe that place is in a cubicle next to you, or maybe it's right down the road from you, but their place is dark. And I just want you to write their name as just a way of praying for them and saying, you know what, I want to take time right now to think about them and acknowledge that I have the light and they're in a place of darkness and I get to carry light at whatever place, whatever point, I get to show light to them. And then when you walked in today, the big box that had all the tags on it last week, today it has invitations for our Christmas Eve service. For some of the people on your Post-it, it may be that person lives in town, and for whatever reason, people will come to church. Like, you can get anybody to come to church with you at Christmas and Easter. Like, your neighbor who does animal sacrifices will probably come to church with you on Christmas or Easter, right? They're just like, sure, yeah, whatever. You're like, what? I just don't get it, but they will. And so as you write those names, as you pray about those people, I also want to encourage you when the service is done today and you're leaving to go out to the box, grab an invitation. Those aren't for you to put on your fridge. They're for you to give to somebody. Grab an invitation, grab 2, grab 3, but take the Post-it, stick it up there, and we'll join you in praying together that maybe they'll respond and maybe they'll be here. And maybe for the first time in their life, Jesus will make sense to them. So just take a moment right now while the band plays and write down a few names. I'll confess that I probably pray for my friends that don't have my faith more than I pray for my family. That's probably something I shouldn't confess, and my family's in the room with me. But I'll also say that one of the greatest joys of my life is when people that I've prayed for, people that I've written down on a Post-it note or slid on a piece of paper in my Bible, when there's that moment when the darkness comes in their life and I just have the opportunity to be there alongside of them, and I find myself being like suddenly God uses me in their life, and I go, man, what is this? And it's like Jesus whispers, you're the light of the world. And it's such a great thing to look back on my life and go, man, there's so many times when I've written somebody's name down and I've seen Jesus work in their life, and it's because we prayed and we trusted God's sovereignty and who He is. And I want to close with Isaiah 49, because this is the heart of God. The heart of God is just loving people that are in the dark, not hating them, but loving them. Even back in Isaiah, he said, is it too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel? I will make you a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. God cares about people, plain and simple. Let's pray. Would you stand with me as we pray? Jesus, I just want to thank you this morning for coming into the darkness in our lives, for penetrating the dark moments of anxiety and fear, relational brokenness, physical brokenness, just the aches of being human. Lord, I just thank you that in the middle of our pain, you visit us, you come to us, you shine light in the dark places, and you bring life. I thank you, Lord. I also pray this morning that you would open our eyes to your words, and that we would see so clearly that those who follow you right back into the darkness to bring more light into this world, because this world isn't light enough. Lord, help us to see that our workplaces aren't light enough, our schools aren't light enough, our neighborhoods aren't light enough, our world is not light enough, and you've sent us into this world to be the light. I pray this in your name. Amen.